I'm 58 years old now, and I've spent the last 33 years of my life protecting a secret that could change everything we think we know about what lives in the forests around us. In a hidden valley 3 hours from my home in northern Washington, there's a family that shouldn't exist according to science. A family I helped save, a family that trusted me with the truth. They're Bigfoot, Sasquatch, forest people, whatever name you want to use. And I didn't just see them once and walk away. I became part of their lives. I watched their children grow. I learned their language. And I made promises I've kept even when it cost me everything. It started in 1991, when I was 25 years old and made what seemed like a simple choice: to bring an injured baby creature home for one night. Just one night to save its life. That one night became 3 decades. And this is the story of what happened after. October 12th, 1991. I was working as a wildlife surveyor for the Department of Natural Resources, spending my days hiking transects through the Cascade Wilderness, counting deer populations and documenting habitat use. It was lonely work, but I preferred it that way. At 25, I was still figuring out who I was, and the forest felt like the only place where I didn't have to pretend. That morning, I was 3 miles into a routine survey when I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A sound I'd never heard before, high-pitched and desperate, coming from somewhere below the trail. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, my pen hovering over my datasheet, trying to place it. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a deer or elk calf. It had a quality that made something primal in my chest tighten, the universal sound of something young and hurt and alone. I should have kept walking. That was the smart thing to do. But I've never been good at ignoring things that are suffering. I pushed through the underbrush toward the sound, my boots sliding on loose dirt as the slope grew steeper. About 20 feet down, the ground dropped away into a small ravine, maybe 10 feet deep, lined with fallen logs and thick ferns. And there, wedged between 2 rocks, was something I couldn't immediately process. At first, I thought it was a bear cub, but the proportions were wrong. The face was too flat, the arms too long. It was covered in dark brown fur, matted with what looked like dried blood. And it was tiny, maybe 18 inches long, curled on its side. As I scrambled down into the ravine, my heart hammering, it made that sound again. A cry that went straight through me. I knelt beside it, my surveyor training warring with something deeper, more instinctive. The creature's breathing was shallow and rapid. There was a gash along its side, not deep but infected, the skin around it hot to the touch even through the fur. One of its front paws was bent at an unnatural angle. Broken, probably. And those eyes, dark, aware, tracking my movements with an intelligence that made my hands shake. "What are you?" I whispered. It flinched at my voice but didn't try to move away. Too weak, maybe. Or maybe it understood somehow that I wasn't a threat. I pulled off my jacket and carefully wrapped it around the tiny body. It weighed almost nothing. As I lifted it, it made a small sound, not the desperate cry from before, but something softer, almost questioning. I should have called it in right then, should have radioed base and reported an unknown animal. But I looked at this impossible creature in my arms, felt its rapid heartbeat against my chest, and thought about what would happen. Government wildlife agencies, researchers. Maybe the creature would live, maybe it wouldn't, but either way, I'd never know. It would disappear into a system I didn't trust. So I made a choice that would change everything. I started hiking back to my truck, this mysterious creature cradled against my chest, knowing I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. And wondering, even then, if I was saving its life or just making everything worse. My hands were shaking as I stood there in that ravine, staring at something that couldn't possibly exist. The tiny creature was maybe 18 inches long, covered in dark fur matted with blood, its breathing shallow and rapid. It looked like a baby ape, but wrong somehow, the proportions off, the face too flat, the limbs too thick, and we didn't have apes in Washington state. We didn't have anything like this. I should have called it in immediately. That was protocol. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way those dark eyes looked at me, so aware, so terrified. Or maybe it was the certainty that if I reported this, whatever this tiny thing was, it would disappear into some government facility and I'd never know if it survived. I had my radio clipped to my belt. All I had to do was press the button and say the words. "Base, this is Surveyor 12. I've got a situation out here. Need you to send someone." Simple, easy. The right thing to do according to every regulation I'd been trained to follow. But I didn't reach for the radio. Instead, I carefully gathered the creature into my arms, feeling how light it was, how fragile. Its fur was coarser than I expected, and beneath it, I could feel every rib. How long had it been out here alone? Hours? Days? The infected wound on its side suggested at least a full day, maybe more. The creature made a small sound as I lifted it, not quite a whimper, not quite a cry. Its uninjured paw reached up and grabbed a fistful of my shirt, holding on with surprising strength. And that gesture, that instinctive clutch for safety, made my decision for me. I wrapped it in my jacket and started the hike back to my truck. With every step, I rehearsed the lies I'd have to tell. If anyone asked why I'd cut my survey short, I'd say I wasn't feeling well. Stomach bug, maybe. Nothing serious, but better to head home than risk getting worse out in the field. The lies came easily, which should have worried me more than it did. My cabin was 40 minutes from the trailhead, isolated enough that neighbors weren't a concern. I'd chosen the place specifically for the solitude, never imagining I'd be grateful for it like this. As I drove those winding forest roads, the creature lay still in the passenger seat, wrapped in my jacket, those dark eyes watching me with an intensity that made my throat tight. Quote to two. I said out loud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet truck. Quote 3-3. It blinked slowly, and I could have sworn it understood. When I pulled into my driveway, the weight of what I was doing finally hit me. I was bringing an unknown creature into my home. I was hiding it from my employer, from wildlife authorities, from everyone. If it died, that was on me. If it was dangerous somehow, that was on me too. And if anyone found out, my career was over, maybe worse. But as I carried it inside and felt that tiny paw still clutching my shirt, I knew I'd already made my choice. For better or worse, this creature's fate was now tied to mine. I just had no idea how completely that would be true. I didn't sleep that first night. I sat in a chair next to the makeshift nest I'd created in my spare room, watching the creature's chest rise and fall, terrified each breath might be its last. Every few hours, I'd try to get it to drink the mixture of goat's milk and electrolytes I'd prepared, using an eyedropper to get tiny amounts past its lips. Sometimes it would swallow. Sometimes it would just lay there, too weak to respond. Around 3 a.m, I found myself talking to it, whispering reassurances like I would to a frightened child. Quote 4. I said, not knowing if that was true. Quote 5. And as I said those words, I realized I'd already made my decision. I wasn't calling anyone, not yet. The nest was just old blankets and towels piled in a cardboard box, but it seemed to work. The creature had curled into the warmth immediately, its breathing evening out slightly. I'd cleaned the wound on its side as best I could. Hydrogen peroxide, antibiotic ointment, a loose bandage I had to change twice when it kept working free. The broken paw was harder. I'd splinted it with popsicle sticks and medical tape, trying to remember the basic first aid I'd learned years ago, hoping I wasn't making things worse. By dawn, I was running on pure anxiety and coffee. I should have been getting ready for work, checking in with base, heading out for another survey. Instead, I was sitting on my floor, watching an impossible creature sleep, wondering what the hell I was doing. My radio crackled at 7:15. Quote 6. I grabbed the handset, my heart racing. Quote 7. There was a pause. Quote ni burahan. Quote 9. Another pause, longer this time. Quote 10. I set the radio down and looked at the creature. It was watching me now, those dark eyes alert despite its obvious weakness. It knew I'd just lied for it. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. I whispered to it. But one day became 2, then 3. Each morning I'd tell myself this was the day I'd make the call, report what I'd found, do the responsible thing. And each morning I'd look at this tiny creature that was growing stronger, that had started making small sounds when it saw me, that would reach for my hand with its good paw when I came near, and I couldn't do it. By the end of the first week, the wound was healing. The creature was eating mashed banana and drinking the milk mixture without help. It would pull itself across the blankets to follow me when I moved around the room, and I'd stopped pretending I was going to turn it in. I'd become something I never thought I'd be. Someone who'd chosen a secret over the truth. Someone who'd decided that protecting this one small life mattered more than protocol, career, or science. And the terrifying part was how right it felt. On the third night, I woke to a sound that sent ice through my veins. Something large moving outside my cabin, circling the perimeter with footsteps too heavy to be a bear. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, as I heard it pause at my back door. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A low, mournful vocalization that resonated through the walls, full of such desperate grief that I felt it in my chest. The baby, sleeping in the next room, suddenly cried out, not in pain but in response, a high-pitched call that was unmistakably recognition. And I understood with absolute clarity. The mother had come back for her child, and she knew exactly where I lived. I froze in my bed, every muscle locked. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stay inside, lock the doors, call for help. But the baby was crying now, that desperate sound getting louder, and from outside came another call, the mother answering, and there was no mistaking the urgency in it, the frantic need. I'd taken her child. That's what she must have thought. Some human had stolen her baby while she was away hunting or gathering food or whatever she'd been doing when the baby got injured. And now she'd tracked us here, following a scent trail or some sense I couldn't begin to understand, and she wanted him back. My hands were shaking as I got out of bed. I could hear her moving again, heavy footfalls on my back porch, the wood creaking under her weight. She could break through that door easily, I realized. If she wanted to, she could tear through it like paper. The only reason she hadn't was probably confusion, maybe caution. She was trying to understand the situation before she acted. I walked to the spare room. The baby was pulling himself up against the side of the cardboard box, his good paw gripping the edge, making those high-pitched calls toward the wall that faced the back of the cabin. He knew exactly where she was. "Okay," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Okay. Okay." I had maybe 30 seconds to make a choice. I could hide, pretend I wasn't home, hope she'd eventually leave. But she wouldn't leave without her baby. She'd find a way in, and then what? Or I could do something so stupid, so insane, that I couldn't quite believe I was considering it. I walked to the back door, my heart trying to climb out of my throat. Through the window I couldn't see anything but darkness and the vague shapes of trees. But I knew she was there. I could feel her presence, massive and waiting. I turned on the porch light, and there she was. She was standing maybe 15 feet from the door, and she was enormous, at least 7.5 feet tall, broad-shouldered, covered in reddish-brown fur that caught the yellow light. Her face was turned toward me, and I saw intelligence there, awareness, and something that made my chest ache. Pure, maternal desperation. We stared at each other through the glass. I watched her nostrils flare, scenting the air. She made that sound again, quieter this time, almost questioning. And from behind me, the baby answered. I didn't think. I just moved. I unlocked the door, opened it slowly, and stepped aside. I said, my voice barely steady. Quote 16. For a long moment, she didn't move, just looked at me, then at the open doorway, then back at me, trying to understand, trying to decide if this was a trap. Then, slowly, she took a step forward. And I realized I'd just invited something that could kill me with one hand into my home, trusting that she'd understand I meant no harm. It was the most terrifying act of faith I'd ever made, and somehow I knew it was the only choice that mattered. I opened the back door slowly, my hands raised, showing I was unarmed. She was there, maybe 20 feet away at the edge of the tree line, and she was massive, at least 7.5 feet tall, broad-shouldered, covered in reddish-brown fur that looked almost copper in the moonlight. But it was her face that made my breath catch. The expression there was unmistakable. A mother's fear, a mother's rage, a mother's desperate hope. She made that sound again, that grieving call, and from inside the cabin, the baby answered. Our eyes met. And in that moment, I made a choice that would define the next 3 decades of my life. I stepped aside and gestured toward the open door. He's inside, I said quietly. He's alive. I've been trying to help him. She moved with a caution that surprised me, each step deliberate, her eyes never leaving mine. As she came closer, I could see details I'd missed in those first seconds, the silver streaks in the fur around her muzzle, the old scar across her left shoulder, the way her hands flexed and unflexed, ready to fight if she needed to. She was terrified. I realized that with a shock. This enormous, powerful creature was as scared as I was. When she reached the doorway, she paused, her head tilted slightly, listening. The baby was making continuous sounds now, excited, urgent. She made a soft rumbling noise in response, and I heard him scramble across the floor toward us. She had to duck to fit through my doorframe. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small and non-threatening as possible, and watched as she moved into my spare room. The baby was there, pulling himself toward her with his good paw, dragging his splinted one, making sounds that were unmistakably, quote, 19 in any language. She dropped to her knees, and that's exactly what it was, a mother dropping to her knees, and gathered him into her arms. The sound she made then was something between a sob and a sigh, pure relief and joy and grief all mixed together. She pressed her face to his fur, breathing him in, running her hands over him gently, carefully, checking every inch for injuries. When she found the bandage on his side and the splint on his paw, she went very still. Then, slowly, she turned her head to look at me where I stood in the doorway. I held my breath, waiting for rage, for violence. Instead, she looked at the bandages again, touched them with surprising gentleness, then looked back at me. And she made a gesture I couldn't possibly misunderstand, one massive hand placed over her chest, right over her heart. Thank you. I felt tears burn my eyes. Quote 20, I whispered. She turned back to her baby, cradling him close, and began to nurse him. I should have left them alone, given them privacy. But I couldn't move. I just stood there watching this impossible scene, a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, showing the most universal behavior in the world, a mother caring for her child. After several minutes, she looked at me again and made a different gesture, fingers pointing at me, then sweeping toward the baby, then both hands coming together. She was asking me something. What happened? How did you find him? I didn't think she'd understand words, but I tried anyway, I said, gesturing to the area where I'd found him. In the forest. I brought him here to help him heal. She watched my face, my hands, as if parsing meaning from the movement and tone. Then she did something that made my world tilt. She pointed at herself, then made a gesture that looked like walking fingers, then pointed at the door. She'd been searching, looking for him, I said, meaning it completely. She studied me for another long moment. Then, deliberately, she reached out with one hand and touched my arm. Just a brief touch, gentle despite the strength I knew was there. And in that touch, I felt something shift between us. Not quite trust, maybe, but understanding. Recognition that we both wanted the same thing, for this baby to survive. She stayed for 3 hours that night, nursing him, examining his injuries, making soft vocalizations that seemed to comfort him. And when she finally stood to leave, she made that gesture again, hand over heart. Then she pointed at me and made a new sign, 2 fingers extended, touching her forehead, then pointing at me. I didn't know what it meant then, but her expression was clear enough. She was saying she'd remember me, and somehow I knew she'd be back. She came back every 3 days. At first, it was just to nurse the baby and check on his healing. She would arrive after dark, moving through the forest with a silence that shouldn't have been possible for something so large, and she would stay for a few hours before disappearing again into the wilderness. But slowly, something shifted. She started watching me, really watching, studying how I moved, how I cared for her child, how I spoke to him in those soft, reassuring tones. And I found myself watching her too, learning to read her expressions, her gestures, the subtle vocalizations she used to communicate with her son. By the end of the second month, we had developed something fragile and strange, a mutual understanding. Not quite trust, but the beginning of it. I started leaving the back door unlocked on the nights I expected her. She'd let herself in quietly, and I'd wake to the sound of her settling in the spare room with her baby. Sometimes I'd get up and sit with them, keeping a respectful distance, just being present. Other times I'd stay in bed, listening to the soft sounds of her caring for him, the gentle rumbles of comfort, the rustle of movement as she checked his bandages, the quiet contentment of the baby nursing. One night in late November, I was changing the baby's bandage when she arrived earlier than usual. I froze, suddenly aware of how vulnerable the moment was, me holding her child, my hands on his injury. But she didn't react with alarm. Instead, she moved closer, watching intently as I cleaned the wound with antiseptic and applied fresh gauze. When I finished, she reached out and touched the bandage gently, examining my work. Then she looked at me and made a gesture I'd seen before, fingers coming together, then pulling apart slowly. She repeated it 3 times, and I realized she was trying to teach me. This was her way of saying heal or mend. Heal, I said aloud, mimicking her gesture back to her. Her eyes widened slightly, surprise, maybe even pleasure, and she nodded. Actually nodded, a human gesture I didn't know she understood. Then she made another sign, hand moving in a circle over the baby, then touching her chest. Quote, 28. I interpreted quietly. She nodded again, more emphatically this time. Then she pointed at me and made a new gesture, one hand extended, palm up, supporting an invisible weight. I didn't understand it first, but she repeated it, this time moving her hand from the baby to me. And suddenly, I got it. Helper, I whispered. Caregiver. She made that rumbling sound of approval and placed her hand over her heart. The gesture I now understood meant acknowledgement, respect, maybe even gratitude. Over the following weeks, we built a vocabulary together. She'd make a gesture, I'd try to interpret it, and somehow we'd find understanding. I learned her sign for, quote, 31, hands cupped together, lifting to mouth. For, quote, 32, quote, fingers trickling downward. For, quote, 33, quote, arms crossed over chest, and more abstract concepts too. Quote, 34, quote, hands clasped together. Quote, 35, fingers spread wide, moving like trees in wind. Quote, 36, hands covering face, then pulling away. That last one she used often, usually with an intensity that made me understand. Hidden was survival. Hidden was necessary. I started teaching her too, or trying to, simple English words paired with gestures. Quote, Mina 37. Quote, 38. Quote, 39. Quote, 40. I don't know how much she understood of the actual words, but she listened carefully, watching my mouth form the sounds, as if trying to understand the mechanics of human speech. The baby was thriving now, his wound fully healed, his paw mending well. He'd started trying to walk, wobbling on 3 legs while the 4th was still splinted. She'd watch him with such obvious pride and worry, the universal expression of a mother watching her child take risks. One evening, as she prepared to leave, she did something she'd never done before. She reached out and took my hand in hers. Her palm was rough, calloused, warm. She held it for just a moment, then brought my hand to her forehead, touching it there briefly before releasing it. I didn't know what the gesture meant in her culture, but I understood the emotion behind it. Connection, trust, the acknowledgement that I'd become part of her child's life, and by extension, part of hers. After she left that night, I sat alone in my cabin and thought about what was happening. I was learning to communicate with a creature science said didn't exist. I was forming a relationship with someone who lived in the spaces between human knowledge, and I was keeping it all secret, lying by omission every single day. But as I looked at the baby sleeping peacefully in his nest, healing because I'd chosen to help rather than report, I knew I'd make the same choice again. Whatever was coming next, I was committed now. To him, to her, to this impossible, beautiful secret we were building together. It happened on a cold November evening, 3 months after I'd found the baby. The mother had arrived earlier than usual, and I was showing her how I'd been teaching her son to grasp objects, helping his injured paw regain strength and coordination. She watched intently as the baby wrapped his tiny fingers around a wooden block, and then she did something extraordinary. She pointed at the block, then at her son, then made a deliberate gesture, hands coming together, then pulling apart. She repeated it 3 times. Watching me carefully, I realized she was trying to teach me. This was her word for quote 41 quote or quote 42 quote. My hands trembled as I mimicked the gesture back to her. Her eyes widened slightly and she made a sound, low, approving. Then she pointed at me and made another gesture, one hand over her heart. I didn't know what it meant then, but later I would learn it was her word for friend. That night changed everything. Once she understood I could learn, she became a teacher. She moved around my small cabin, touching objects and showing me their signs. The window, fingers framing her face, then opening outward. The door, hand moving like a hinge. Water, fingers trickling downward. Food, cupped hands to mouth. Each gesture was deliberate, precise, and when I repeated them back to her, she'd nod with what I can only describe as satisfaction. The baby watched these exchanges with bright, alert eyes. At 3 months old, he was getting stronger every day, his injured paw healing well, his movements more coordinated. And he was learning too, I realized, watching his mother teach me, absorbing this bridge we were building between our 2 species. After about an hour of this vocabulary lesson, she paused and looked at me with an intensity that made me set down the cup I was holding. She touched her chest, then made a new gesture, a sweeping motion that seemed to encompass herself, the baby, something larger beyond them. She repeated it, watching to see if I understood, I said quietly. She made that approving rumble again. Then she pointed at me and made a different gesture, arms spread wide but held close to the body, protective. She was asking me something. When I could feel it, something important. I took a breath. Quote 46. I said, not entirely sure what I was agreeing to, but knowing it mattered. Quote 47. She studied my face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in my expression. Then she did something that made my throat tight. She reached out and placed both hands on my shoulders, her enormous hands engulfing them completely. And she lowered her forehead to touch mine. Just for a moment. A gesture of trust so profound, it made me realize the weight of what I'd just promised. When she pulled back, there were tears in my eyes. I mean it, I whispered. I won't let anyone hurt you. She made a new sound then, softer than anything I'd heard from her before, almost like a sigh of relief. Then she moved back to her baby, gathering him up, and prepared to leave. But before she went, she turned back to me and made one more gesture, the friend sign, hand over heart, but this time she held it there, pressed firmly, looking directly into my eyes. I returned the gesture. My hand over my own heart, and in that moment, I understood that I'd just made a promise that would shape the rest of my life. I wasn't just keeping a secret anymore. I'd become an ally, a guardian, maybe even family, in whatever way that word translated across the impossible distance between our species. After she left, I sat on my porch in the cold November air and thought about what had just happened. I'd been taught a language. Not English, not any human language, but something older, simpler, more honest. A language of gestures and touch and trust. And I'd made a promise in that language that I knew I'd keep, no matter what it cost me. I went back inside and found my notebook, the one where I'd been keeping records of the baby's healing progress. I turned to a blank page and started drawing the gestures she'd taught me, trying to create a record of this vocabulary we were building. Friend, family, safe, hidden, help, the building blocks of a relationship that wasn't supposed to exist, the foundation of a secret that would become the most important thing in my life. And somewhere in the forest, moving through the darkness with her baby, was a mother who'd chosen to trust a human, who'd chosen to believe I could be part of their hidden world. I just hoped I could live up to that trust. In early spring, she brought the others. I was outside chopping wood when I felt that familiar sensation of being watched. I looked up, and my heart nearly stopped. There were 5 of them at the forest edge. The mother, 2 adult males, one massive and clearly older, the other younger and more wary, and 2 more juveniles, slightly larger than the baby I'd been caring for. Her other children, I realized, her family. The older male stepped forward, and I saw the protectiveness in his stance, the way he positioned himself between me and the others, the father maybe, or an uncle. He made a deep rumbling sound, and the mother responded with a series of gestures and vocalizations. I couldn't understand the specifics, but the meaning was clear. She was vouching for me, explaining who I was and what I'd done. The older male studied me for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he made that same gesture she had taught me months ago, hand over heart. Friend. I lowered the axe carefully, setting it down on the chopping block, keeping my movements slow and non-threatening. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, quote, 51. The younger male, probably adolescent based on his size, made a huffing sound and shifted his weight nervously. One of the juveniles, a smaller one with lighter fur, moved closer to the mother, seeking reassurance. But the other juvenile, slightly larger and bolder, took a few steps forward, curiosity apparently outweighing caution. The mother made a gentle sound and gestured toward the cabin. Then she made the sign for her baby, the one I'd been caring for, and pointed inside. She was telling them he was here, that this was where he'd been all these months. I nodded toward the back door. Quote 52. The older male exchanged a look with the mother, and it was absolutely a look, a moment of silent communication that any married couple would recognize. Then he made a gesture I'd learned meant yes or agree, a slight nod combined with both hands opening, palms up. I walked slowly to the back door and opened it. The baby, hearing the commotion, had pulled himself to the doorway. When he saw the others, he made a sound I'd never heard from him before, pure joy, excitement, recognition. The 2 juveniles rushed forward, and suddenly there was a reunion happening on my back porch that made my chest ache. They touched him, made soft vocalizations, examined his healing paw with gentle fingers. The smaller juvenile, his sister, I guessed, kept making a trilling sound and touching his face. The bolder one, a brother maybe, kept circling him, as if unable to believe he was real. The older male approached more slowly. When he reached the baby, he knelt down and gathered him up with a tenderness that completely contradicted his enormous size. He held the baby close, making a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the air. The baby responded by grabbing onto his fur and burying his face in the male's chest. Father and son. I was watching a father hold his child for the first time in 6 months. The mother stood beside me, and when I glanced at her, I saw something in her expression that transcended species: relief, gratitude, the exhaustion of a mother who'd been carrying a terrible burden alone and could finally share it. Quote 55, I said quietly. She made a gesture I'd seen before, a sweeping motion that encompassed all of them, then touched her heart, then pointed at me. Family accepts you. The younger male was watching me with obvious suspicion, keeping his distance. I didn't blame him. I was probably the first human he'd been this close to, and everything in their culture clearly taught them to fear us, to hide from us. But the father set down the baby and approached me. He was massive, at least 8 feet tall, shoulders broader than a doorframe. He could have snapped me like kindling. Instead, he reached out one enormous hand and touched my shoulder, the same way the mother had done months ago, a gesture of acknowledgement, of acceptance. Then he made a new gesture, one I hadn't seen before. He pointed at the baby, then at me, then brought both hands to his chest and nodded deeply. Thank you for saving my son. I felt tears prick my eyes. I managed. Over the next few hours, they explored the area around my cabin with cautious curiosity. The juveniles were fascinated by everything: my woodpile, my truck, the satellite dish on my roof. The father examined my shelter with what seemed like assessment, perhaps evaluating whether this human's territory was safe for his family to visit. When they finally prepared to leave, the mother made a gesture that looked like an invitation, hand beckoning, then pointing toward the forest. "Come with us sometime." I nodded. I'd like that. As I watched them disappear into the trees, the baby riding on his father's shoulders, I realized something profound had just happened. I'd been accepted, not just by one individual, but by a family, a group, maybe even a community. I was no longer just the human who'd found an injured baby. I was becoming part of their world. And that meant my responsibility had just multiplied by 5. Everything changed on a humid July morning in 1992 when I was out on a survey transect and ran into Derek Simmons, another DNR surveyor I'd worked with a few times. We were comparing notes on elk populations when I saw his expression change, his eyes fixed on something over my shoulder. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I turned and felt my stomach drop. About 40 yards away, partially hidden in the undergrowth, was one of the juveniles, the curious one who sometimes followed me on my surveys. He must have been tracking me, and I'd been so focused on the conversation I hadn't noticed. Derek was already reaching for his camera. "Don't," I said, grabbing his arm. "Derek, please don't." But he pulled away, raising the camera. And I had to make a choice in that split second that would force me to become someone I never thought I'd be. "A liar," I said, my voice sharp with false irritation. Quote 62. He lowered the camera slightly, confusion crossing his face. Quote "Did quote says free." I interrupted, moving to block his line of sight. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. Quote fee 5. Behind me, I prayed the juvenile had the sense to disappear. I couldn't look, couldn't check, had to keep Derek's attention on me. "I don't remember any memo about that," Derek said slowly, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. And I've never seen a bear stand upright like that for so long. For like 3 seconds, I laughed, and it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Come on, man. Bears stand up all the time. You know that." I watched his face, saw him processing, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with what I was telling him. The lie hung between us like something physical. And I felt sick. Derek was a good guy, honest, the kind of person who trusted his colleagues, and I was exploiting that trust to protect a secret he didn't even know existed. "I guess," he said finally, but he was still looking past me toward the spot where the juvenile had been. It just seemed, I don't know, different. "Heat shimmer," I offered, grasping at anything. "Does weird things to how things look at a distance. Plus, if they've been shaved for the study, it changes their silhouette." I clapped him on the shoulder, forcing casualness I didn't feel. Quote 74. That got a small laugh from him, and I felt something inside me break a little. He believed me. He was actually believing the complete garbage I was feeding him. Quote 75, he said, finally lowering his camera completely. Quote 76. We finished our conversation about elk populations, and I managed to keep my voice steady, my manner normal. But the whole time, part of my mind was screaming. What had I just done? I'd lied to a colleague, potentially compromised scientific integrity, and for what? To protect creatures that most people didn't even believe existed? When Derek finally headed back to his truck, I stood alone on that trail and waited. After about 5 minutes, I heard a soft sound behind me. The juvenile emerged from the trees, moving cautiously. He made a questioning gesture, the sign for quote 77, followed by a questioning tilt of his head. Quote 78, I said quietly, my voice shaking. Quote 79. He made a sound, low, almost apologetic. Then he touched his chest and pointed at me, the sign for connection, for watching over. He'd been protecting me, I realized, or trying to, following at a distance in case I needed help. I know, I said, my throat tight, but you can't, not anymore. It's too dangerous. He studied me for a long moment, those intelligent eyes reading something in my expression. Then he made the sign for hidden and melted back into the forest, disappearing so completely it was like he'd never been there. I walked back to my truck on shaking legs and sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I could trust myself to drive. I'd crossed a line today. I'd become someone who lied easily, convincingly, to protect a secret. And the worst part was knowing I'd do it again. Because Derek would talk. He'd mention what he saw to other surveyors, maybe to his supervisor. And if the story spread, if people started looking more closely at this area, the family would be in danger. I started the engine and headed home, already planning my next lie. I'd file a report about the quote 83 create false documentation if I had to. Whatever it took to muddy the waters, to make sure no one looked too closely at what was really living in these forests. That night, I lay awake thinking about the person I was becoming. Someone who manipulated, who deceived, who put the safety of a hidden family above honesty, above science, above everything I'd been trained to value. And I couldn't even feel guilty about it. Because when I closed my eyes, I saw that juvenile's face, saw the trust in his eyes when he'd followed me into the forest, saw the mother holding her baby for the first time after months of separation. Some secrets, I was learning, were worth any price, even the price of your own integrity. I told Derek it was a bear, a young grizzly that had been partially shaved by researchers. I made my voice confident, annoyed even. Like I couldn't believe he'd fallen for something so obvious. I said, the lie flowing easier than I'd expected. They tranquilized them, shave patches for identification, put radio collars on them. Didn't you get the memo? He lowered his camera, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. That didn't look like any bear I've ever seen, he said slowly. Movement was wrong, and it was standing upright. I laughed, and the sound felt hollow in my own ears. For like 2 seconds. Bears do that, Derek. Come on. That night I lay awake knowing I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. I'd chosen them over my own species. I'd become the guardian of a secret that could cost me my career, my credibility, everything. And the worst part, I knew I'd do it again. But Derek wasn't the last. Over the following months, the lies multiplied like fractals, each one branching into others, building a structure of deception I had to maintain constantly. When my supervisor asked why I kept requesting the same survey areas, I told him I was tracking a specific elk herd's migration patterns. When a ranger mentioned hearing strange vocalizations in the forest near my usual routes, I blamed it on coyotes and wind through the canyon. When equipment went missing from a logging site that was getting too close to the family's territory, I filed reports about bear activity, knowing damn well it was me who'd sabotaged it. The person I'd been, honest, straightforward, someone who valued scientific integrity above everything, was disappearing. Being replaced by someone who could lie without hesitation, who could manipulate data, who could look colleagues in the eye and feed them complete fiction. I started keeping 2 sets of notes, the official ones, carefully sanitized that I turned in with my reports, and the real ones, hidden in a locked box in my closet where I documented everything. The family's movements, their behaviors, the gestures I was learning, the moments of connection that made all the deception feel worthwhile. My social life contracted to almost nothing. How could I go out for drinks with coworkers when I was terrified of what I might accidentally reveal after a few beers? How could I date someone when I was spending half my free time hiking into the forest to visit a family that wasn't supposed to exist? People noticed. Quote 9. Derek asked me one day about 6 months after the incident. Quote 90. Quote 91, I said, another lie. Quote 92. He nodded, accepting it, and I felt that familiar stab of guilt. Derek was a good person. He deserved better than a friend who lied to him constantly. But what was I supposed to say? Quote 93, quote? That would go over well. The isolation was crushing sometimes. I'd be sitting alone in my cabin, eating dinner by myself for the 100th night in a row, and I'd think about calling someone. My brother in Seattle. an old friend from college, just to hear another human voice, to feel connected to my own species. But I never did, because every conversation was a potential landmine. Every question about my life was something I'd have to deflect or lie about. The mother seemed to understand somehow. One evening when she came to visit, the baby was almost fully grown now, nearly 4 feet tall and thriving. She found me sitting on my porch looking particularly worn down. She made a gesture I'd learned meant, quote, 94 or quote 95, her expression concerned. Quote 96, I said. Quote 97. She sat down beside me, which always surprised me given her size. She was quiet for a moment, then she made a series of gestures. Quote 98 followed by quote 99, followed by quote 100, quote 101, I said. Quote 102. She nodded slowly, then made another gesture, one hand reaching out to another, clasping. And I realized she was right. I wasn't alone in this. They'd been carrying this secret for generations, maybe thousands of years. The burden of staying hidden, of watching humans spread across their territories, of knowing they couldn't reveal themselves without losing everything. I'd only been doing it for a year, and it was already wearing me down. They'd been doing it for lifetimes. How do you stand it? I asked quietly. She made a gesture toward the baby, who was playing with his siblings at the edge of the clearing. Then she touched her chest over her heart. The answer was simple. Love. Family. The knowledge that the secret kept them safe. I nodded, understanding. That night, after they left, I pulled out my hidden notebook and wrote, 1992. The year I learned that some truths are too dangerous to tell and some lies are too important not to maintain. The year I stopped being who I was and became who I needed to be. The year the lie became my life. I closed the notebook and locked it away, then went to bed knowing that tomorrow I'd wake up and lie again. To my colleagues, my supervisor. Anyone who asked too many questions about why I spent so much time alone in the forest, and I'd keep lying for as long as it took to keep them safe. Because that's what guardians do, even when it costs them everything. Late that autumn, the mother came to me with something in her hands, a bundle wrapped in woven bark fiber. She set it down carefully between us, then stepped back and made a gesture I'd learned meant look or see. Inside were objects I'd never seen them use before, tools, carved with surprising delicacy. A small blade made from worked stone, a needle crafted from bone, and something that made my throat tight, a small carving of her baby, the one I'd saved, rendered with such care and detail it could only be called art. She pointed at the carving, then at me, then made a new gesture, hands cupped together, then extended outward, offering. She was giving this to me. But as I reached for it, she stopped me and made another gesture, one hand pointed at me, the other sweeping toward the forest, then both hands coming together. She was asking me something, and slowly, through gestures and patience, I understood. She wanted me to come with them, to see where they lived. My heart started racing. In the year since I'd found the baby, they'd been coming to me, to my territory. I'd never asked where they went when they left, never pushed to know their secrets beyond what they chose to share. It felt like a boundary I shouldn't cross, but now she was inviting me, offering to show me something no human had probably ever seen. Your home? I asked, making the gesture for shelter combined with the sweeping motion she used for family. She nodded, then made another gesture, fingers walking, a journey. It was far, not a casual visit. How long? I asked, holding up fingers, trying to communicate days. She held up 2 fingers, then 3, uncertain. 2 or 3 days, maybe. I'd have to take time off work, make excuses, disappear into the forest with no real explanation of where I was going. I thought about my supervisor, who was already skeptical about my frequent solo surveys. Thought about Derek, who still sometimes looked at me with that expression that said he wasn't quite sure he believed my bear story. Thought about all the lies I was already telling, and how this would require more. But I looked at the carving in my hands, the baby rendered in wood with such love and skill, and I knew my answer. Yes, I said. When? She made a gesture that meant soon, then pointed at the sky. The moon was waning. She wanted to travel when the nights were darkest, I realized. Less chance of being seen. Over the next few days, I prepared. I told my supervisor I was taking a few personal days to do some backcountry hiking. "You know me," I said with a forced laugh. "Can't stay away from the wilderness." He'd frowned, but approved it. I packed light: sleeping bag, minimal food, water purification tablets, first aid kit. I didn't know what to expect, what I'd need. The night before we left, I sat in my cabin and wrote a letter, just in case. I sealed it and left it on my desk where it would be found if I didn't come back. Dramatic, maybe. But I was about to disappear into the forest with creatures that could kill me easily if they wanted to. Trust only went so far. She came for me at dusk. The whole family was there. The father, the juveniles, even the baby I'd saved, now almost my height and moving with confident grace. They all made the greeting gesture, hand over heart, and I returned it to each of them. The mother handed me the bundle again. This time, when I reached for it, she didn't stop me. I unwrapped it carefully and held the carving of the baby, feeling the smooth wood under my fingers, the careful detail of his features. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick. "I'll treasure this." She made a gesture I'd seen her use with her children, hand to her heart, then extended toward me. Love, or something close to it. Then she turned toward the forest and made the gesture for, quote, 119, quote. I took a breath, shouldered my pack, and stepped into the trees behind her. I was leaving behind everything familiar, everything safe, to enter a world that existed in the spaces between human knowledge, a world I'd been protecting from the shadows for a year. Now I was going to see it, really see it. And I had no idea if I'd come back the same person I was when I left. The father fell into step beside me, his massive presence somehow reassuring rather than threatening. The juveniles ranged ahead, moving through the darkening forest with practiced ease. And the baby, my baby, the one I'd found broken in a ravine, looked back at me and made a gesture that meant safe, followed by friend. I nodded to him and kept walking, each step taking me deeper into a secret that was about to become so much bigger than I'd ever imagined. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I wondered, what if I never want to leave? What if seeing their world makes living in mine unbearable? But it was too late for those questions now. I was committed, I was going home with them, and nothing would ever be the same again. The hike took 2 days. We traveled deeper into the Cascades than I'd ever been. Through terrain so remote and difficult, I understood immediately why no one had ever found them. The mother led the way, with the father and older juvenile flanking us, clearly protective. They moved through the wilderness like water, reading the forest in ways I was only beginning to understand. On the second evening, we crested a ridge, and she stopped, turning to gauge my reaction. Below us lay a valley I'd never seen on any map, ringed by steep cliffs, accessible only through a narrow passage we'd just traversed. And in that valley, scattered among the ancient cedars, I saw shelters. Simple structures, but deliberately built. I saw fire pits. I saw what looked like drying racks for meat and plants. And I saw people. 6 more of them, 3 adults and 3 younger ones, watching our approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to clear wariness. The mother made a carrying call, and they responded. And I realized I was being introduced. I was being brought home. My legs felt weak. I'd known intellectually that there had to be more of them, that a family of 5 couldn't represent an entire species. But seeing them here, in their own space, living their lives, it made everything suddenly overwhelmingly real. I couldn't finish the sentence. There weren't words for what I was feeling. The mother made a gesture, sweeping arm toward the valley, then touching her heart. Home. Pride. This is ours. As we descended into the valley, the others approached slowly. One of the adults, an older female with graying fur, made a series of vocalizations to the mother. I couldn't understand the specifics, but the tone was clear. Questioning, maybe concerned. The mother responded with her own vocalizations, gesturing toward me, making signs I recognized. Quote, 123. Quote, 124. Quote, 125. The older female studied me with eyes that held generations of caution. Then she looked at the baby, who was staying close to my side, and something in her expression softened. She approached me directly, and I held my breath as she reached out and touched my face, her rough palm against my cheek. A gesture of greeting, maybe, or assessment. She made a low sound, then stepped back and made the, quote, 126 gesture, but her eyes held a warning. I was accepted, but watched. Over the next few hours, I was introduced to the others. A young adult male, probably the brother of the juveniles I already knew. An elderly male who moved slowly but with dignity. His fur almost completely silver, and the young ones, a toddler barely 2 feet tall who hid behind her mother's legs, and 2 others who watched me with open fascination. 14 individuals total. That's all there were in this valley. 14 people living and hiding, their entire world contained in this remote pocket of wilderness that would fit inside a few city blocks. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a family I was protecting. This was potentially an entire community, maybe even most of their species in this region. As darkness fell, they built a fire in a carefully concealed pit that wouldn't be visible from the ridge above. I watched them work together, gathering wood, arranging stones, the practiced movements of people who'd done this countless times. The young ones helped, learning, being gently corrected when they made mistakes. They shared food with me. Berries, roots I didn't recognize, dried meat from some animal they'd hunted. The older female presented it to me formally, and I understood this was significant. Sharing food was acceptance. I was being welcomed not just as a visitor, but as someone who could be trusted at their table. That night, I sat by their fire and watched them interact. They had language, complex vocalizations and gestures I was only beginning to understand. They had humor, too. The juveniles were teasing each other about something, and the adults were making sounds that could only be laughter. The baby, my baby, was showing off his healed paw to the other young ones, making exaggerated gestures that I recognized as him telling the story of his injury and rescue. I was watching culture, society, family, everything that made us human, reflected in beings who looked different but felt achingly familiar. The mother sat down beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. She made a gesture toward the others, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she made a new sign, both hands extended, palms up, holding something precious. Then she pointed at me. I said quietly. She nodded slowly. Then she made another gesture, one I'd never seen before. She pointed at the valley, at her people, then made a fading motion, like smoke dissipating. Then she pointed at me and made a different gesture, hands clasped tight, holding on. My throat tightened. You think you're disappearing, and you want me to... What? Remember? Protect? She made the yes gesture, but added something else. She pointed at the young ones playing by the fire, then at me, then brought her hands together. She wanted me to be part of their lives, to help ensure they had a future. I looked around at this impossible valley, at these impossible people, and felt the weight of what she was asking settle onto my shoulders. I was 26 years old. I had no power, no resources, no ability to protect them from the world that was slowly encroaching on every wild place left. But I looked at the baby playing with the other children, healthy and whole, because I'd made one choice in a ravine a year ago. And I knew I'd make this choice too. I'll do everything I can, I promised. I swear it. She placed her hand over mine, and we sat there by the fire while her people laughed and talked around us, and I understood that my life had just been redefined. I wasn't just a wildlife surveyor anymore. I was a guardian, a witness. Maybe the only human who would ever see this valley, these people, this fragile, beautiful world that existed in the spaces between human knowledge. And I would protect it, no matter what it cost. I stayed for nearly a month that first time. I called in sick to work, claiming a bad case of flu, and hoped no one would check on me. Those 27 days changed everything I thought I understood about intelligence, culture, and what it meant to be human. They had language, complex, gestural, supplemented with vocalizations. They had names for each other, though their vocal anatomy couldn't produce sounds like ours. They had stories they told their young, histories passed down through generations. And they had rules, sophisticated social structures about sharing food, resolving conflicts, caring for the vulnerable. The baby I'd saved, they'd given him a name sign that translated roughly to the one who came back. And they'd given me one too, a gesture that meant, quote, 134, quote, or maybe, quote, 135, quote. I watched them make tools, prepare food, teach their children. I watched them play, mourn, celebrate, and I couldn't escape the thought that terrified me most. These weren't animals. They were people, a different kind of people, but people nonetheless. The elderly male, the one with the silver fur, became my unexpected teacher. He'd gesture for me to sit beside him while he worked, crafting tools from stone and bone with practiced precision. He moved slowly, deliberately, showing me each step. How to identify the right kind of rock, how to strike it at the correct angle, how to shape it into something useful. One afternoon, he made a blade and handed it to me. Then he made a gesture. Learn. Remember. You're teaching me your way of life, I said quietly. He made a sound, low, sad, and gestured toward the young ones playing nearby. Then he held up gnarled fingers, counting. Not many. Then he pointed at the mountains beyond the valley and made a fading gesture. Disappearing. How long have you been hiding? I asked. He thought for a moment, then began making marks in the dirt. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Generations upon generations of living in secret, watching humanity spread across the landscape, shrinking their world year by year. The social structures fascinated me. They had clear hierarchies, but not based on dominance. The elderly were treated with profound respect. The young were protected by everyone, not just their parents. When someone found food, they shared it according to need. The nursing mother ate first, then the children, then the hunters who'd expended energy, then everyone else. I watched disputes get resolved through gesture and mediation rather than violence. When two of the juveniles fought over a toy, the mother stepped in with calm authority. She made them face each other and communicate, explain the conflict through signs, work through it. Come to resolution. No screaming, no physical punishment, just patient guidance toward understanding. They told stories at night around the fire. The elderly male would make elaborate gestures, his whole body involved in the telling. The children would watch with rapt attention, occasionally interrupting with questions that he'd answer patiently. I couldn't understand most of it, but I recognized what was happening. Oral history, cultural transmission, the same thing humans had been doing for thousands of years. One story seemed to be about humans. He made gestures I recognized as representing us, small and walking upright on two legs. He showed humans spreading across the land, building, hunting. Then he showed his people retreating, hiding, learning to vanish. The children listened solemnly. And I realized this was their fundamental lesson. Stay hidden or die. On my 18th day there, something happened that broke my heart. The smallest child, the toddler, approached me curiously. She'd been shy at first, but gradually warmed to my presence. She came up and touched my hand, making a questioning sound. Her mother immediately rushed over and pulled her back, making sharp gestures. Danger, human, stay away. The little one looked confused, then hurt. She pointed at me and made the friend gesture, questioning why she had to stay away from a friend. The mother knelt down and through a series of patient gestures explained, "This human, yes, friend, but other humans, dangerous. You must learn to fear them, to hide." I watched this mother teach her child to be afraid of my species, and I wanted to protest. To say, not all humans, some of us are good, but I couldn't, because she was right. If this child approached the wrong human, a hunter, a logger, someone with a camera, her entire family could be destroyed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the simple shelter they'd prepared for me, listening to the sounds of the valley, and thought about what I'd witnessed. These people had culture, language, social bonds, art, history, everything that defined humanity. They loved their children, honored their elders, told stories, made tools, laughed together. and they were teaching their young to live in terror of us, of me. On my 27th day, as I prepared to leave, the mother approached me. She made a gesture I'd come to understand as deeply important, both hands over her heart, then extended toward me. Then she made a new sign, a circle encompassing the valley, then pointing at me, then putting a finger to her lips. Quote, 143. I said, my voice rough with emotion. Quote, 144. She nodded, then did something that made tears stream down my face. She pulled me into an embrace, this massive, powerful being, holding me with incredible gentleness. And I felt the trust in that gesture, the faith she was placing in me. When I finally hiked out of that valley, leaving them behind, I was a different person than the one who'd arrived. I'd seen something that redefined everything I thought I knew, and I carried a secret so heavy, so profound, that I knew it would shape every choice I made for the rest of my life. I returned to my cabin, to my job, to the human world, but part of me stayed in that valley, and it always would. I went back to my regular life, but nothing was the same. I did my surveys, filed my reports, had beers with coworkers who talked about football and complained about their bosses, and the whole time, I was thinking about them, about the mother who'd trusted me, about the valley hidden in the mountains, about the fact that I was probably one of the only people in the world who knew they existed, really existed, not as legend or myth, but as living, thinking beings with families and cultures and lives. The ethical weight was crushing. I had evidence that could revolutionize anthropology, biology, our entire understanding of human evolution. But revealing that evidence would destroy them. Scientists would want to study them. Government agencies would want to track them, protect them, which would mean monitoring, restricting, controlling. The media would turn them into spectacles. And the life they'd lived for thousands of years, hidden and free, would end forever. So I made my choice. I would be their secret keeper, their guardian, and I would carry that burden alone. The temptation was there, though. God, it was there. I'd lie awake at night, thinking about what I could do with this knowledge. I could write the most important paper in the history of anthropology. I could prove that humanity wasn't alone, that we had cousins who'd survived in the shadows while we built civilizations. My name would be in textbooks forever. One night, I actually started writing it, sat down at my desk with a notebook, and began documenting everything I'd seen. The valley's location, the population count, their social structures, their language, scientific observation, clinical and precise. I wrote for 3 hours straight, filling page after page with details that would change the world. Then I stopped and read what I'd written, and I imagined what would happen next. The research teams arriving, helicopters flying over the valley, scientists in the forest with tranquilizer guns wanting to quote 145 quote camera crews, documentary filmmakers, tourists with binoculars hoping for a glimpse. The valley ringed with monitoring equipment, every movement tracked and recorded. I imagined the mother, who'd held me with such trust, being darted and tagged like a bear. I imagined the children growing up in a world where they were never alone, never unwatched, never free. I imagined the elderly male who'd taught me to shape stone with such patience, spending his final years behind chain-link fence in some haute quote 146, designed by people who'd never asked what he wanted. I tore up every page I'd written, burned them in my fireplace, and watched the words turn to ash. The next day at work, Derek cornered me in the parking lot. Quote 147, he said casually. Quote 148, my heart stopped. Quote 149, quote 150. He continued, quote 151. I had seconds to make a decision. I could encourage him, lead him down a path that might eventually uncover the truth, share the burden of this secret with someone else, or I could shut it down completely. Quote 152, I said firmly. Quote 153. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant he decided whether to believe me or not. Quote 154. He said finally. Quote 155. Quote 156, I said, and hated myself for how easily the lie came. After he walked away, I sat in my truck and put my head in my hands. I'd just shut down someone's curiosity, someone's pursuit of truth. Everything I'd been trained to value as a scientist, I'd just suppressed. But what was the alternative? Let him investigate? Let him potentially stumble onto something that would put the family at risk? That night, I drove up to the mountains. I didn't go all the way to the valley. I'd promised only to visit when invited. But I hiked to a ridge where I could see the general area where they lived, and I sat there as the sun set. I chose you, I said out loud to the empty forest, over my career, over truth, over everything. I just hope that's the right choice. The wind moved through the trees, and somewhere in the distance I heard a call. Low, carrying, unmistakable. One of them, maybe the father, maybe just acknowledging my presence. Or maybe I was imagining it, projecting meaning onto random sounds because I needed to believe this sacrifice mattered. I thought about my parents, who'd raised me to value honesty above everything, about my education, all those years learning to pursue knowledge regardless of where it led, about the scientific method, observation and documentation and peer review. I was betraying all of it, sitting on the most important discovery in human history and choosing silence. But I'd also spent 27 days watching a mother teach her daughter to fear humans. I'd seen the elderly male's sadness when he counted his dwindling people. I'd felt the little one's hand in mine, so trusting, before her mother pulled her away and taught her the lesson that would keep her alive. Hide from humans at all costs. How could I betray that? How could I be the one to prove that trust was misplaced? I couldn't. It was that simple and that complicated. I drove home that night knowing I'd made my choice. The secret would stay buried, the family would stay hidden, and I would live with the weight of what I knew, alone, for however long it took. Some truths, I was learning, were too dangerous to tell, and some promises were too sacred to break, even when breaking them might change the world. It was 1996 when everything almost came crashing down. A logging company got permits for a section of forest that bordered their territory, not the valley itself, but close enough that the noise, the activity, the human presence would drive them deeper into the wilderness or force them to flee entirely. I found out through work channels, saw the maps, and felt panic like I'd never known. I spent weeks trying to find legal ways to block it, environmental concerns, endangered species, watershed protection, but I had no standing. No evidence I could present, no way to explain why this particular section of forest mattered more than any other. That's when I did something I still question. I sabotaged equipment. Nothing that would hurt anyone. Sugar and fuel tanks, cut hydraulic lines, disappeared survey stakes. Enough to create delays, cost overruns, frustration. Enough that combined with my official reports about geological instability and critical elk habitat, the company eventually decided the timber wasn't worth the hassle. I'd crossed another line. I'd become someone who broke the law to protect a secret, and I couldn't even feel guilty about it. The first time I poured sugar into a fuel tank, my hands were shaking so badly I spilled half of it on the ground. It was 2 a.m, and I was crouched beside a bulldozer in a staging area, committing a crime that could get me arrested, fired, maybe even jailed. I kept thinking about the toddler in the valley. She'd be about 5 now, old enough to understand the world around her, young enough to still believe she was safe. If the logging started, if the machines came roaring through the forest just miles from her home, what would that do to her? To all of them? I poured the sugar and walked away, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Over the next 3 months, I became someone I didn't recognize. I filed false reports about spotted owl nesting sites. I accidentally contaminated soil samples to suggest environmental hazards. I misplaced permits and lost paperwork. And twice more, I returned to the staging area under cover of darkness to ensure equipment failures that would cost the company time and money. My supervisor started asking questions. "You seem to be spending a lot of time in that specific area," he said one afternoon, looking at my survey routes. "Any particular reason?" Just thorough documentation, I said smoothly. Want to make sure we're not missing any environmental concerns before they start cutting. He studied me for a moment, and I wondered if he could see the guilt written on my face. But he just nodded. Good. Keep it up. The worst part came when I had to face the logging crew supervisor, a guy named Tom who'd worked in these forests for 30 years. He was frustrated, exhausted, dealing with equipment failures he couldn't explain, and environmental concerns that seemed to pop up everywhere he looked. It's like the forest doesn't want us here, he joked one day when our paths crossed. Every time we try to make progress, something else goes wrong. I forced a laugh. Just bad luck, probably. Yeah, maybe, he shook his head. Got a crew of 20 guys whose paychecks depend on this job, you know? They've got families, kids, and every delay costs them money. That hit me hard. I was protecting one family by potentially hurting 20 others, good people. Working people who'd done nothing wrong except take a job in their industry. That night, I lay awake wrestling with the ethics of what I was doing. Was I right to sabotage honest workers trying to earn a living? How many human lives was I allowed to disrupt to protect a family that, according to science, didn't even exist? But then I thought about the alternative. The machines tearing through the forest, the family fleeing, scattering, maybe never finding another valley safe enough to call home. The elderly male, who'd taught me to shape stone, forced to spend his final years running from human encroachment. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't. In late June, I hiked up to the valley to warn them. The mother met me at the entrance, and I could see the stress in her posture. They'd heard the machines in the distance. They knew something was happening. Through gestures and our shared vocabulary, I explained what I was doing. That I was trying to stop it, but I didn't know if I'd succeed. That they might need to prepare to leave. She made a gesture I'd never seen before, both hands pressed to her chest, then extending toward me, trembling. Gratitude mixed with fear. Then she turned and called to the others. The whole family gathered, and the father approached me. He placed both massive hands on my shoulders and looked directly into my eyes. Then he made a gesture that meant, quote, 172, quote, pointing at them, then at me. You are one of us. I felt tears burn my eyes, I said. 3 weeks later, the logging company announced they were pulling out. Too many delays, too many environmental red flags, profit margins too thin to justify the continued investment. They'd moved their operation to a different area where the timber was more accessible and the regulations less complicated. I stood in my cabin and read the announcement, and I felt simultaneously relieved and disgusted with myself. I'd won. I'd protected them. But I'd done it through deception and sabotage and manipulation. I'd hurt people who didn't deserve it to protect people nobody knew existed. Was I a hero or a criminal? A guardian or a saboteur? I didn't know. I still don't. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I'd do it again. Every time, without hesitation. Because some things mattered more than following the rules, and protecting that family, keeping them safe and free and hidden, was worth any price, even the price of my own soul. By 2003, the baby I'd saved was fully grown, nearly 7 feet tall, with the reddish fur of his mother and his father's broad shoulders. He had a mate now, and in the spring of 2004, she gave birth. They brought me to see the infant when she was 3 days old, this tiny scrap of fur with eyes barely open, making small mewing sounds as she nursed. The mother, my friend of 13 years now, made a gesture I'd seen before, the offering gesture, the one that meant gift or honor. And then she did something that made my eyes burn. She took my hand and placed it gently on the infant's head, a blessing, an acknowledgement. Her son, the one I'd saved, watched with what I can only describe as gratitude, and I understood. This child existed because I'd made a choice in a ravine 13 years ago. This family continued because I'd opened my door to a desperate mother. The weight of that, the impossible, beautiful weight of it, nearly broke me. The infant was so small, smaller even than her father had been when I'd found him, maybe 14 inches long, with fur so fine it looked like down. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine instinctively. holding on with that universal gesture of trust that transcends species. "Hello, little one," I whispered. "Welcome to the world." Her mother, I'd learned her name sign over the years, a gesture that meant, quote, 177, quote, or something close to it, watched me with protective alertness. She was young, maybe only 8 years old herself, and this was clearly her first baby. But she'd allowed me close, trusted me with her most vulnerable moment because her mate had vouched for me, because the family had accepted me years ago. The one I'd saved, I called him River in my mind, though his actual name sign was more complex, made a gesture toward me, then toward his daughter. He was naming her, I realized, showing me her name sign, a gentle wave, like water lapping at a shore. "Maybe," or I said, and River nodded, understanding the tone if not the words. The original mother, the one who'd first trusted me 13 years ago, sat beside me. She was showing silver in her fur now, moving a bit slower, but her eyes were still sharp, still intelligent. She made a series of gestures, pointing at River, then at the baby, then at me, then bringing her hands together in a circle. The cycle continues. Because of you, I had to look away, blinking hard. I was 38 years old. I'd spent the last 13 years lying to everyone I knew, sabotaging equipment, filing false reports, living a double life. I had no wife, no children of my own, no family except for the one in this hidden valley. And yet, holding this tiny infant's hand, feeling her grip my finger with such perfect trust, I couldn't regret any of it. Over the next few hours, I watched the extended family interact with the new arrival. The other children were fascinated, wanting to touch her, to see her up close. The adults took turns holding her, making soft vocalizations of welcome and protection. The elderly male, now ancient and moving with great difficulty, touched her head gently and made a long, complicated gesture that I understood to be a blessing or prayer. This was culture. This was family. This was everything that mattered, distilled into its purest form. River sat beside me at one point, and we watched his daughter together in companionable silence. Then he did something that surprised me. He reached into a pouch he carried and pulled out something wrapped in leaves. He unwrapped it carefully, and I saw what it was. The wooden carving his mother had given me years ago, the one of him as a baby. I'd given it back to the family during one of my visits, thinking it should stay with them, but River had kept it. And now he pulled out another carving, clearly new, clearly made by his own hands. It was his daughter, rendered in the same careful detail, the same love. He handed it to me and made the offering gesture. A gift, a thank you, a recognition that I was part of this child's story, part of this family's continuity. "River, I can't," I started, but he pressed it into my hands insistently. Then he made a new gesture, one I'd never seen before. He pointed at me, then at his heart, then at his daughter, then made a protective gesture, arms curled around, sheltering. He was asking me something. To watch over her? To protect her as I'd protected him? "Always," I said, my voice breaking. "I promise, always." He nodded, satisfied, and made the gesture for family again. Not friend, not helper, family. That night, sleeping in my usual spot in the valley, I thought about the path my life had taken. Most people my age were married, had kids, were building conventional lives with houses and retirement plans and family photos on the wall. I had none of that. What I had was this: a hidden family in a secret valley, a new generation being born into a world that wanted to destroy them, and the knowledge that I was probably the only human alive who would ever witness this. I had a promise I'd kept for 13 years and would keep for the rest of my life. I had a tiny carving of a baby, made by the baby I'd saved, given in gratitude for a choice I'd made in a ravine when I was 25 years old. I had everything that mattered, and nothing the world would ever understand. The infant made a small sound in the darkness, and I heard her mother respond with soft reassurance. A lullaby, maybe, in a language older than civilization. And I fell asleep knowing that whatever I'd given up, whatever I'd sacrificed, it was worth it for this, for the continuation of something beautiful and fragile and impossibly precious, for the next generation. I'm 58 now, and my knees ache when I hike up to the valley. The mother has silver in her fur, and the baby I saved has children of his own, 3 of them now. I've watched their family grow from 8 to 14 over 3 decades. I've learned their language well enough to have simple conversations. I've shared their food, slept in their shelters, been trusted with their most vulnerable moments. And I've kept their secret, even when it cost me relationships with people who couldn't understand why I spent so much time alone in the wilderness. Even when it meant lying to everyone I cared about. Even when it meant carrying a truth so heavy some days I could barely breathe under the weight of it. People ask me sometimes why I never married, why I live alone, why I seem content with isolation, and I can never tell them the real answer. I'm not alone. I have a family. They just live in a hidden valley in the Cascades, and they trust me with the most important secret in the world. Last month, I made what might be my final hike up to see them. My knees aren't what they used to be, and the trail that seemed easy at 25 feels nearly impossible at 58. But I needed to see them one more time, needed to know they were still there, still safe, still hidden. The mother met me at the valley entrance like she always does. She's old now, moving slowly, her fur almost completely silver. But when she saw me, she made the greeting gesture, hand over heart, and I returned it, both of us acknowledging the decades of trust between us. River's children swarmed me immediately. The oldest, the girl whose hand I'd held when she was 3 days old, is nearly grown now. She made the sign for my name, the bridge, the helper, and showed me a carving she'd made, a human figure and one of her people, hands clasped together. Me and her grandmother, I realized, the beginning of our story. I said, and she understood the tone, making a pleased sound and tucking the carving back into her pouch. We sat around the fire that night, the whole family together. 14 of them, 3 generations, all alive because of choices made 33 years ago. The elderly male passed away 5 years back, and I still miss him. But his great-grandchildren play where he used to sit and teach, and I think he'd be happy about that. The mother made a gesture to get everyone's attention, then turned to me. Through a series of signs and gestures, she told a story. I'd heard pieces of it before, but never the whole thing, never laid out like this for the entire family. She told them about finding her baby in a ravine, injured and dying, about tracking him to a human's dwelling, terrified but desperate, about the human who'd stepped aside and let her in, who'd helped instead of hurt, who'd kept their secret for decades. She told them I was family. Not human family, not quite their family, but something in between. A bridge, like my name sign said, someone who belonged to both worlds and chose to protect the one that needed protecting most. The young ones listened with wide eyes. They'd grown up knowing me, but this was their history, the story of how their family survived because one human made a different choice than most of his kind would have. When she finished, River stood and approached me. He was in his prime now, strong and healthy, a father and provider. He made a gesture I'd only seen a few times, both hands extended, then brought to his chest, then extended again. Deepest gratitude. Life debt. You don't owe me anything, I said quietly. You've given me more than I could ever give you. But he shook his head and made another gesture. Yes, we do. Then he pointed at his children, at the family around the fire, at the valley itself. All of this exists because of you. I felt tears streaming down my face, and I didn't try to hide them. Quote 188, I said. Quote 189. The mother made a sad sound, understanding. Then she made a new gesture, one I'd never seen. She pointed at the young ones, then at me, then made a continuing motion, a circle that went on and on. They will remember. The story continues. Will you keep hiding? I asked. Will you stay safe? She made the gesture for yes, then added another, always. They would stay hidden. They would survive. They would endure as they had for thousands of years in the spaces between human knowledge. That night, sleeping in the valley for what might be the last time, I thought about everything they'd taught me, about patience, about the importance of silence, about how love doesn't require language and family doesn't require blood. They'd taught me that some secrets are too precious to share, even when sharing them could change the world. That sometimes the greatest act of love is to let something remain wild and free and unknown. They'd taught me that I could live an entire, meaningful life in the margins of society, that I didn't need recognition or validation or even understanding. I just needed purpose. And they'd given me that. In the morning, when I prepared to leave, the whole family gathered to say goodbye. Each one made the farewell gesture, hand over heart, then extended outward. The youngest ones didn't fully understand why I was sad, but they felt it, mimicking their parents' solemn expressions. River walked me to the edge of the valley. Before I left, he pulled me into an embrace, this massive being holding me with such gentleness, and I felt everything we couldn't say in words pass between us. Gratitude, love, goodbye. I hiked out of that valley knowing I might never return. My body won't make this journey much longer, but I carry them with me always, in the carvings I keep locked away, in the language I speak to no one, in the secret that has defined my entire adult life. People think I'm alone. They pity me, this strange man who never married, who keeps to himself, who spends his time hiking in the wilderness for reasons he won't explain. But I'm not alone. I never have been. I have a family in a hidden valley. I have 3 generations who trust me with their lives. I have a purpose that has sustained me for 33 years. And I have a secret that I'll take to my grave, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because protecting it is the most important thing I'll ever do. That's what they've taught me, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.